Three, two, one. Welcome to the Reactive Training Systems podcast. This is your producer, Jim Ellie, and today Mike Teixeira and I chat with Ben Escrow about his shower thoughts. On our last episode with Ben, we talked a lot about how his experience in coaching has evolved over time, and in this episode, we talk about the potential problems with a data-driven approach to coaching within the powerlifting community and what we can or what we should do about it. If you enjoy listening to this podcast, please consider sharing it with your friends. And if you have any questions about it or have any comments, you can reach us at Reactive Training Systems on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And as always, you can get our free online training log at reactivetrainingsystems.com.
So basically, I guess what probably spurred, like the root of the thought, was just reflections on, now that I don't still have any clients. I was just thinking back over the past 10 years of like what I learned, but also what allowed me to have whatever level of success I did have, and how that sort of compares to, I think, the competition of the market of coaching, and then also the way that a lot of people approach coaching, I guess, competitively, in terms of there's like this standard where you look at what everybody else is doing and you see the people who are having the most success, and I think there's always this subconscious drive to at least do a little bit of what they're doing to keep up. And that tends to be data-based, because you can't deny the impact of data-based. Like, if anybody does, well, just look at your purchases on Amazon and all of these other companies who are using data-based decisions to drive their algorithms and stuff. And I think the thought that I had was like, if everybody is competing to say they're data-based and they're at least as good as the other people or better in some way, number one is how are they measuring that? And number two is, are they getting too lost in trying to be data-based and actually losing where they might be most impactful as a coach? And I think just like different personalities have different pros and cons for things they're better at and things they're worse at, I think that directly applies to coaching. And I've seen it. I think that's like the branch point, because we can go off and talk about anything from there, because it's true in formulating, it's true in coaching, it's true in anything. I think if you're going to build onto anything greater, you need to start at this sort of first principles base of like, what are the things driving everything here? And what should I be measuring? What should I be focused upon in order to make any higher level decisions? So,
oh yeah, like you see that all the time with people. Kind of like it's a cliche that I find myself throwing around quite a bit, is to keep the goal the goal. You see all kinds of things when people start looking at the data of training, right? That they start thinking about, how do I increase my volume? How do I do something with all of these numbers that I'm getting out of my training? It can be any of them, intensity, whatever. I don't want to leave anyone to think that their number of choice is anything but a proxy. And that would include me. So my number of choice is estimated 1RM, which I think is a pretty good proxy, but it's still a proxy, because the thing that you care about is performance and competition, and a climbing estimated 1RM is a pretty good proxy for that, but it's not the same thing, and your volume numbers, your frequency numbers, any of that stuff is certainly not the same thing. But it cuts the other way too, that I see people. It's funny, and I think we're going to find ourselves in a discussion on the marketplace of coaching versus like what like artisanal coaching would be if you were to just do it without any care for the market whatsoever. But you see people that are like, well, the whole market is going this data driven way, so they cut back the other direction, say, well, all this focus on the numbers doesn't make sense, and the only numbers I care about are the PRs that we're putting up. Like, okay, that's cool, and I think that's a fine place to look at things, but it's like as soon as something goes wrong, it's like your car. Like, I don't care about the engine. I don't care about what's going on underneath there. I just want the car to go fast. Well, that's great until the car isn't going fast, and then you go, oh crap, now what?
I feel like when you're coaching a lot of lifters, it's like the most. If you're new to coaching, I think that it's difficult to figure out what numbers really matter because you don't have that experience of what can actually go wrong. Like you described, Mike, when the car stops working, well, what else matters? What is the other thing that allows them to grow? I think I posted a meme the other day or today. It was something like, it's not impressive if you're talented. It's impressive if you are in the game for a long time. And I don't really agree 100% there. Like, I think it is impressive if someone hops into the sport and they're just like balling, right away.
Yep.
But at the same time, it sounds like what is interesting is what happens when that talent requires some tune-up. What do you look at?
Yeah, well, and that's the inevitable point is at some point competition will catch up and you're going to have to not rely on just your talent. And I think that is a very important pivot point that you see in the careers of any lifter who does it more than for a couple years or succeeds for more than a couple years, is at some point the talent will catch up. I think Taylor's a great actually example of that. Is like I don't think we ever expected people to catch up that quick, and it happened a lot quicker than we thought. Really, within a year's turn time, it was like, holy shit, he's like 100, almost 100 kilos above people at Worlds, and then right into nationals in October. Everybody's right in the mix with it. But I think it's an interesting, almost self question, and maybe this does all come back to knowing oneself. But it's like and I think you guys can let me know if I'm going down the wrong path here, but it's if you say to yourself, everything is equally important, then that means nothing's important because you haven't tiered anything. So you're basically chasing everything. And just like you said, what happens is one thing goes wrong and you don't know which was the most important. So that means everything went wrong. And you have no means to actually go back and reassess and evaluate your strategy and then develop a new plan from it. So I think that becomes really the most important thing. Is it's like looking at the mirror, and maybe even if not everybody's capable of doing it themselves, it's having a trusted conversation, or maybe you work with a coach now and it's like having that conversation of saying, what do you think I'm good at? What are my strengths and weaknesses? Because again, if you never know that, then how are you going to be the most effective coach or even making your own best life decisions? Like, you're kind of managing yourself, right? Like, and I think this has just all been this elliptical path of thinking of what I've done in my past, and then would I do it any differently, and what did I ultimately learn? And so I guess it's just this reflection of thinking, what have I learned and what can I provide and give back from that time, rather than just like disappear and not have a conversation about it,
Yeah. Well, you reminded me of something else that I'd listened to recently. I was listening to another podcast. They were interviewing Andrew Yang, the presidential candidate, and he was talking quite a bit about being data-driven. Like, he considers himself a data-driven guy and tries to make decisions based on data and so on, except for the decision to run for president to begin with, because that's not a data-driven decision for someone who's relatively unknown, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, that's interesting, and honestly, it's probably a good place to be, like, Yeah, you need, like, having data to support your decisions is smart, obviously. But then there's some things where it doesn't answer the question, or it doesn't, it provides information, it provides context, but it doesn't tell you what to do. The decision sometimes is counter to the direction of the data, or maybe I should say the information, the stories that we tell ourselves about what the data is saying isn't always the answer to the question that we really have.
Well, I think again, my impression is you're touching on intuition, which can't be removed from the equation. Is like, I do think at some point intuition is sort of your gut feeling, which hopefully is based on some type of observation from the past of seeing patterns and stuff like that. But I think you're ultimately right, and I think that's a great point. Is like, you're still going to be emotionally influenced. Being data driven, even for the best person who's, let's just say, closest to robot that you can be and still be human, it's still idealistic to say you are purely data driven. Even the most data driven person I know is at least closely as emotionally driven as well. And
Sure.
and you're right, because I think there's, if you only focus on numbers, I do think you can almost maybe ignore or forget the creative element of it, which is still pulling some levers and playing with things. Like, you're still asking a question in going down a path and writing an intervention. At least that's my opinion of
Yeah.
it. Is you're not writing an intervention, and then as soon as you've written it, you're like, that's it, moving on, problem
Yeah,
solved.
you're
It's like
just forgetting about it.
yeah, exactly. You're writing a program or a potential solution, but written into that potential solution is actually a hypothesis.
It reminds me of when Mike did his first, like we first publicized emerging strategies at the Brooklyn seminar. And Mike, you have a quote, something like, systems drive behavior. And if the system isn't encouraging a behavior that we want, then it's unlikely you're going to just do it on your own.
Yep.
And that data driven perspective, like, it's really helpful if you also communicate with the person who's giving you the data, because maybe the interpretation of that data from their perspective is valuable and it would help with your intuition. I think personally, a lot of times when we're coaching, it's like, hey, this is what the data is saying. What are your thoughts on it? Like, what do you think might have contributed to, you know, that?
See, you're touching on something really important there, and it's that we're talking about data, and it's like this array of facts, you know. But that, I mean, I kind of want to say it's meaningless, like without the narrative that you attach to it, because, like, we'll just take a. I mean, there's as many examples as there are data sets, but let's talk about coaching and lifting. If we look at block reviews, and you're looking for patterns, but then you start to tell yourself a story about what this pattern means, and hopefully that reflects reality, but
Right.
it is something that you're layering on top, and yeah, there's always room for interpretation, and you could give the same data set to a different coach who's going to place importance on different facts in that data set, and they may come to a different conclusion. Especially when we're talking about something like coaching, where it's individualized, it's complicated, it's not clear what relationships are affecting other variables and things like that.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I think that's an enormous point, which I'm actually happy you brought up, Jim, because it's true in that you can assume a lot of things just from looking at numbers on a spreadsheet if you don't actually ask the context of the person. And ultimately, you're still dealing with people, and you do need the story that drives that and writes that come back with the best possible. Well, I guess it's you're double checking whether your story from their story is accurate, right? Um, but go ahead.
They may have some additional facts to layer onto it as well.
Yep, yep.
Yeah.
It's like with RPE in general, just like taking it baseline to training. Someone rates the RPE at a 9 for a given session. Like I always think about injury and pain management as like outlier examples. When a lifter's afraid of getting hurt from a given lift, it seems like they're likely to rate the RPE much higher than if you were to watch their video and then say what the RPE was. Now, whether that's a true statement from their perspective or from yours, like ultimately that's the number they put on the spreadsheet. And if you were to just look at that and say, oh, it's an RPE 9, like, or RPE 8, whatever they put on there, and you don't even double check, like you might even not know that they're pain avoidant, they're fear avoidant, or they're just avoiding that experience in general.
Yeah, so it seems like to me, and it's funny because as I listen to us all talk about it, I almost think about what is the simplest conclusion you can draw from that cuts through everything that we're saying, the theme, and I think it's that you need to eliminate assumption as much as possible from it. It's like if someone could take away from the conversation, like what, okay, like we're talking about a lot of different things. I'm writing notes, like here's 90 things have been brought up. I think that's actually a key element. And like I said, as I listen, I do think that that's probably something that I would imagine. Well, I'll only speak for us. I think that that's probably where we've all had success is in doing that, or in attempting to do that best you can. Because you're right, you can really run very far with an assumption from just a one-dimensional measure, which is just the number, like you said, whether it's subjective or objective, that number on the sheet just becomes the number.
Do you feel like, so we're talking about data-driven decisions. Do you guys feel like a lot of coaching decisions can feel very short term, oriented? Like I know a lot of times it's what's the next best thing to do is kind of the thought. Um, and that's where I tend to be biased towards, but I wonder if there's an issue with that, especially in the context of like this next development block. What's the next thing to do?
Mike, I'm going to let you go first, and then I'll chime in after.
I mean, I think it's going to depend on your philosophy and kind of how you see the world. So, like from where I sit, like, yeah, there's issues with that, but to go beyond that is an assumption, to say, well, we're going to do X in this development block to prepare us for Y in the next development block. And, well, I mean, there's gets to be more assumptions layered into that, and the further out you go, the harder it becomes to justify those, I think. Whereas kind of the solution that we've come to is to say, well, it's not that you shouldn't make those, but that you shouldn't make those decisions without justification. So yeah, I tend to default toward planning more short-term types of things, not looking too far into the future. But then as I get to know a lifter and get to know their responses, then we can project a bit further down the road, but I mean, I just don't see much point in coming up with, annual plans and things like that. Like if I think about goal setting, and especially like in any sort of business, we're going to talk about goal setting. They want you set your 10-year goal. Like what? Like, I've been in business now for 10 years, which I think is a hell of an accomplishment. And when you asked me in the beginning, if you said set a 10-year goal, I wouldn't have imagined anything remotely like this. Like this is not on the table. So like, why would I think that my projection for the next 10 years is going to be any better? Well, that's not the point. The point is that it gives you some direction. Okay, fine, fair enough. But in the context of sport and powerlifting, we have the direction. You have it already. So the whole purpose of like these longer term processes and things like that. Okay, I mean, you want to compete at nationals next year or something. All right, fine, but I don't see why that should drive any decisions in the next block or two. Until it gets a little bit closer. Ben, what do you think?
I do think that can be the very practical example of trying to force a square into a round hole is, or to say it not so abstractly, I think you almost have to default into being a short-term, make most of your decisions based on short-term information. I think you should have a plan for where you're trying to go long-term, but be flexible in how you're going to get there. Because the reality is, like, let's just say you're writing out a somewhat traditional periodized block, even for a powerlifter, and like you're going to progress, sevens, fives, threes, or something. Even if you're undulating, let's just say the pattern is ultimately going in that direction, where you're going to drop reps, increase intensity. But something happens along the way. If you're stuck to the idea of we're supposed to be doing fives now, like we have to still do fives, but something happens to prevent you from allowing to do that, like I think we can all know through experience that when you try to force a lifter into something that everything is saying is not appropriate, you're going to either burn them out, they're not going to get the performance that they think, or they're even worse, they're going to get injured. So I do think, and funny enough, the way that that we would always write out, this is when I was independent and then with TSG as well, the way we'd write out is we'd check in week to week and see how things were going and adjust if we had to. We'd have a plan where we wanted to go, where we're trying to get, but there's still micro adjustments either week to week, and even it could be shorter if you're getting feedback that says it requires that. And so our assessment, almost similar to like RPE, what you're doing is you're assessing. You could be session to session, it could be week to week, whatever. You need to have some level of assessment short term, because I think the other side of the problem that you need to consider is if you've let someone go too long just sort of coasting and not reassessed, and again you're stuck on the long-term thinking is, well, eventually I know they'll get there, so I'm leading them there, is like, I think the other aspect of the problem is if you're talking about people who are competing, whose endpoint is to be the best they can, they want to get as strong as fast as they can. So it's almost like that some of that responsibility is written into it for you as the coach to not just coast them. Even though it's probably the lowest risk for injury, it's also going to not necessarily get them where they want to be. And we know at the speed that people are progressing these days is like, it's very, very hard to say you're not influenced as a coach to try to push a little bit.
It's difficult when you have a lifter too that sees themselves progressing as rapidly as someone else, and then it's like they're like, hey, I want to add 60 kilos to this next block, and it's like, well, okay, what block am I going to write to add 60 kilos to your squat? Like, I don't know the answer sometimes, um and it's like I'm always personally conflicted of, okay, sure, this block, I think it's going to go well. Maybe he will. Like, I don't want to prevent that mindset, but at the same time, I think if there's a bias that or something that I struggle with personally is, all right, let's hold on. Like, just look, we'll get there when we get there. It's almost like, are we there yet? When you're driving on a road trip, like, we're close.
Right.
We're on the right path, I think.
And I think that's the most responsible choice to make, because let's look at it as if we're practitioners for almost like a physician or something. Where to start is pretty well defined. Like, someone comes to you with this very clear symptom, where to start is very clear. But how they respond to that first intervention, it gets much more muddy as time goes on and the response becomes less predictable. So just like you said, is like, let's say there's in the perfect world, we had this book of programming that said, this person comes to you with XYZ well-defined variables. This is exactly what you should do. That's fine, but it's like immediately after that happens and you've gotten the response that you wanted, it doesn't mean that it's equally as predictable as time goes on. And I think that's where the challenge comes, and that's really where it becomes interpretive and like you said, it does it for lack of a better word, it becomes, this is my best guess at what to do.
You guys, I gotta take a quick break here.
Sure.
I'll
Okay.
be right back.
Yeah, no problem.
You can either keep going or not.
I mean,
I'll pick back up.
I have some pretty good thoughts on that.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. Let's see where it goes.
Yeah. And I think what you said, Ben, about making the next best guess becomes more intimidating the longer you work with a lifter, because now you also have buy-in to consider, and like
Yeah.
maintaining trust and maintaining their desire to work with you, because especially the way that we write training, I almost intentionally don't write anything after the block that I write. So I'll write 4 weeks of training or however long, you know, the way we do it, it's kind of like time to peak. So if their time to peak is around 5 weeks, I'll write 5 weeks of training, and then I'll intentionally not think about anything else. And as Mike's, you know, quote that I was mentioning before, the system drives behavior. I have that system in for me, because otherwise, as you mentioned, you can let your athletes just coast and, you know, hey, we have this plan to go from 6s to 5s next block, and so I don't need to think about you because that's already set in stone. And that, in my mind, is a problem. And it was a problem when I was doing that. It's just like that was how everyone was writing programs. So I didn't feel as bad about it. You know, I didn't feel like there was anything I needed to change, because that's what periodization by Bamba said.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I don't know if you kind of struggled with that as well.
So I have two thoughts on it. One is that I think you need to go back and think about why they sought you out or why they came to you in the first place. And I've actually responded to people. This was earlier on where they'd, like you said, the buy-in, it was more of an uphill battle where they were questioning whether this was the best. And I would ask them back, if you were getting what you wanted, why did you reach out to me? So I think you need to also ask that question to yourself, which is, am I making better decisions for them than they would themselves? And I do think overwhelmingly, especially if you're talking about a highly competitive lifter, the answer is overwhelmingly going to be yes, because especially when you think of that competitive personality, the people at the top, the most important thing to them is to win. So they will most likely ride themselves harder and harder just to stay up there at the top, because we know that we live in a society now that you can immediately see what someone's doing in training. And I don't care whether you admit it or not, you're influenced by seeing someone squat, you know, out squat their last competition max for triples or something.
Especially if you're close, especially if you're like up there with them.
That's exactly. It's like you don't want someone to be progressing faster than you. Even if it's not on a competition setting, when you look at those people getting faster, it's impossible to eliminate that influence of, I need to get stronger faster now, because if not, I'm falling behind. So I think that's a big part. And I lost my second thought. I apologize.
Well, you know, stop me if I'm rehashing old territory at this point, but I'm surprised that hasn't been, I guess, weaponized more than it has been. You know, like, if I think about it, from where I sit now, having made the mistakes that I've made, looking at your competitors on social media cannot bring anything good. You know, like, I really don't think it can give me motivation. Well, chances are you had that anyway. I would say most lifters are doing the best that they can do in training anyway. You know, maybe it can help refine your focus a tiny bit, but there's also a pretty big downside risk that it makes you make bad training decisions. And if I think about that, like as utility, like I'm surprised that nobody's got like fake plates and stuff and starts posting.
We don't know. They don't. Maybe you're exposing somebody without
Right.
even knowing it.
Right.
I will. Well, let me present this argument to that.
Well, before you do, I don't know of anyone who's used fake plates like to intentionally F with their competition, but I do know people who have posted lifts specifically because they know it's going to get under the skin of their competition. So there is definitely a gamesmanship aspect to just the social media game, and I'm thinking like, I don't know, just from a defensive standpoint, like you could just not play that game, and be better off.
Well, I think you've highlighted another important role of a coach beyond programming is context. Is like, I think any responsible, and it depends on how well the communication is. Maybe not every lifter might communicate that they're intimidated or they've seen that or something. But I think if they bring that to you, that I think it's a great opportunity to say exactly what you said is like, you should be ignoring that, and it's not indicative of really anything. And actually have that conversation, because in their mind they're just going to run with that longer and longer and longer without that outside point. It's like you're counseling essentially. But I was just going to say that based on how many people make successful attempts with those hype lifts, I would say maybe people are using fake plates, because how few of them actually make those lifts in competition. Like they're routinely either squatting high or doing something that's deceptive. It's almost like the in motion Photoshop.
It's cool you said that, Ben. I have the perspective that people aren't hitting the weights that they want because they're not really aware of when they're performing their best. Like, you're gonna hit the weight when you feel good in training, but you have what, probably 20 to 50 times more opportunities to hit what you want in training than you do at a competition.
Yep.
And I've always, every time I see someone post a lift that's just probably out of pocket, as they say, it's like, well, that's great. Like, actually, it is really cool. And I think sometimes when you have it, you just got to go for it, because you might not actually have that opportunity at another time, because we might not know how to control that peak experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that I have a way, and like RTS has a way, but it's all just trying to do it in the best way we can to put you in the best position on game day. But like, I don't know if people are aware of that. Like, it's like they have it in their head that they're going to hit this weight. And I'm actually way more surprised how like USAPL Nationals happens. It's like at USAPL Raw Nationals this year, the level of like precise competition, like how close people can get to one another is kind of shocking, because it seems like a lot of times, at least from the viewer, not behind the scenes and not knowing their training history, that they're just hitting the weights that they need, which is different from the take what's there approach. Like, how do you also make it that like, it's almost like they're making it there. It's like, how did you do that? That's insane. From like a watching from the sidelines.
I mean, and again, what you see in these conversations, I think, is personal bias and interpretation. But I do love the perform on demand aspect, and I think, again, I'm going to refer back to how the conversation started, which is minimizing assumption and controlling as many variables as you can. And for that reason, I actually don't like letting people go for broke in training in a block, because I do think it sets this precedent where now that's the bar that they're expecting at least on meet day. So even if you set, like you said, like, we know adaptation, typically it looks like stock market response. You have peaks and valleys constantly, and you hope for a linear pattern. And I mean, I would love to find somebody who has this perfectly linear line that looks like, a regression. But to this day, I've never seen it. You could run the stat on on the data from open powerlifting, and you will see competition to competition, you will probably get the same erratic, hopefully linear path. So um, for that reason, I do think there is a certain level of um, self control that comes into it as well, and I think that's hard, and I think there is buy-in for that, especially with a lifter who wants to be in with the pack. And you're talking about not just winning a powerlifting competition, because let's be blunt, there's a lot less incentivization to win nationals as there is to get 100,000, 200,000 Instagram followers. You know what I mean? Or more. So I think I would go back and ask the first layer question is, what is your ultimate goal in this? Is it to have a really good highlight reel of great PR lifts to post, or is it to post the best lift in total when it matters in the competition? And I think that should really drive your decisions. But it's it's hard to not want it all. And I think that's part of the theme too, is like, as the coach wants to get all and everything for their lifter, and the lifter wants it all as fast as they can possibly get. So at some point somebody has to step back and be like, is this sustainable over time? And that's a hard question. That's been a hard question for me over, like Mike said, the decade of doing it, is like, um, it's very easy to get caught up in that cycle of like, we're getting it fast, we're getting it faster than they think, I'm getting it faster than I think I could for them. Let's see if we can get it even faster. you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I had a thought there, but I kind of lost it.
the the desire to want it all is something that I feel like when I talk to coaches my age, I mean, I've been in it 6 years as of this year, like, and luckily I'm pretty heavily influenced by kind of how Mike approaches things, because I think when I started, I was very anxiety driven. I remember watching at the Arnold, before I was coaching at the Arnold, other coaches and how they reacted to their lifters when they did well. And I always thought that, like, if you're going to be at the Arnold and you're going to watch your lifter compete, you know, it's almost it always felt like it was equally about the coach as it was for the lifter, based on how the coaches would usually respond to the successes of their lifters. And I always thought, like, oh, I'm excited for that. I'm super pumped for that. And then I actually had the opportunity to coach, and have had that opportunity to coach at the Arnold. And like, first time I did it, it was like, okay, so this is my time to like freak out and get super hyped for my lifter, and like, still focus on them. But ultimately it was kind of a shock to realize that, yeah, I can get hyped up, but that doesn't necessarily help them perform. Like, some lifters don't want your coach to be equally like anxiety driven as the lifter. Like, you should, I mean, in future competitions, the approach I've taken is more like calm, and I need to make this decision for the lifter because they're freaking out sometimes, and they need me to just make the call that's going to put them in the best spot based on what lift they actually took. And I mean, I don't know if every coach has that perspective, but I've just found it to be way more stressful for me to try to match the hype level
Sure.
of the athlete.
Um, yeah, I think you'd hope in time that you realize that it's not about you as the coach. Like, your job really is to be there for them and be what they need you to be to perform best. And I think to some degree that actually there is a process that comes in either selecting or accepting the clients that you kind of fit best with. Like, and I know that more now, more coaching organizations that have multiple people, they start to have a process where they fit the client with the coach, and I think that's very appropriate. Um, I think the other part is what were you were saying something about going in at the Arnold.
Well, I was just talking about how I always perceived it to be like this super insane experience as a coach, because I would literally watch coaches jump up and freak the hell out after the lifter does the thing. And just to be clear, I think it's important to be excited, and to hype, just congratulate them. Like it's something, if your lifter does something awesome and you've seen them progress, like it's really difficult not to feel that level of excitement with them. I think the biggest challenge is that energy needs to be held on to and just hold on, make the right call,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? Let them put the right weight on the bar, and then if they hit it, cool, do your thing. Like hype them up, give them a hug, whatever. But I always had a weird when I first did it. When I first coached at that level, it was always a weird experience because realized it wasn't really helping the lifter calm down if they were on that
Yeah,
edge of.
it's your own emotional management too, as well as theirs. It's like, yeah, you got a couple. You're basically juggling. You're emotional juggling to make the best or right decision. And um, I do think in that way maybe it's almost like you can have a hazard plan. Like I think my own was always, okay, what do I know they want? What do I think they could do on an absolute perfect situation? And then I'm going to pull back from that a little bit. And I think it's funny because, whenever you watch, or you, of course, like I read comments when Taylor would post something and stuff like that, and it's like, that was so easy. You had 10 more kilos. You had 5 more kilos. Blah blah. Um, yeah, probably in a
Benefit
perfect.
of hindsight.
Yeah, exactly. Or in a perfect world.
Yeah.
And it's not so much about holding the lifter back as it is about playing the cards and the highest probability, selection is like, you're right. Like you can be super hyped. Your lifter can be super hyped. It's their job to think they're invincible that day. That doesn't mean they are. You know what I mean?
It's always like the alternative. Do you not like a lot of people don't realize what the alternative of that video is?
Yeah.
Right? They have 5 kilos in
Yeah.
the tank. That's a great decision. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, look, if as the stakes come higher, I think that's where meet day coaching becomes more and more complicated, and ultimately experience is probably, assuming the coach is able to learn from their
Yep.
mistakes, experience is probably going to help a lot with that.
So you actually reminded me of the other point I was going to say, and you were talking about being influenced by Mike, and I think that's really where um, stuff like this, especially having the power of a group that's led by people or a person who's been doing this for a while and has lived both ends of it, where they've been on the platform at the high level and they've also coached at the high level, is the wisdom that comes from that, because you hope any good leader could protect you from making the same mistakes they did. That's to me, and that's again, it parallels well with the coaching thing, is I think optimal progress is not avoiding mistakes, it's just not doing any that are unnecessary, right? Like it's not fighting yourself in the process. Mike, I don't want to keep talking, because if you thought up your thought again, I don't want I don't want to keep you waiting.
No, yeah. Well, I suppose just mostly to build on that. Like, I've given that some thought as well, and I suppose any of these kind of rules of thumb. Well, it's like a virtue, right? Like you can, if you got the right amount of it, it's a virtue. But if you have too much or too little, then it's not. And you were talking about hopefully having the wisdom to protect people from, the more serious mistakes that were made, and guiding them down a better path. I wonder sometimes though if, like, it's just kind of in my nature to question my own decisions, I guess. But like, I wonder sometimes if I'm making decisions that end up being too conservative, or too much one way or too much the other way. And I suppose that goes back to your optimization comment as well, that some mistakes are part of the process.
Yep.
That's normal. It's what you've got to do to find out what's gonna help and what's not. You just don't want to make any that you can't pull back from.
Yeah.
Or I suppose that cost you too much time, which is basically the same thing.
Yeah, the catastrophic ones. I don't know. I think in my opinion, that means that that's somebody that should be uh, either coaching or helping individuals in any field, not just powerlifting, because you sort of need to obsess over that. I really think you need
Yeah.
to, because if you're not asking yourself those questions, you can become a very dangerous person. Um,
Yeah, the notion of the person who, I don't know, like that's a cult leader, right? Like somebody
exactly.
that
It's unchecked
never
power.
questions their own decisions or
Yeah,
never questions their own
yeah. It's a
It just
god
decisions.
makes it
complex.
difficult to follow. Like when if you accept that you're being led by someone, but you're also seeing that person question themselves. I think the initial perspective would be, oh, they're questioning themselves, I can't follow them. But like if anything, from my perspective, that makes me feel much way better about my decision to follow them because even this person doesn't think they're perfect. So that means I don't have to think I'm perfect. And I can make calls that are, risky and I can learn from my mistakes and I can think in the same way of, hey, maybe I'm not the most brilliant, person ever to walk the earth. Like, because ultimately, a lot of times on Instagram and when you're listening to a lot of people, it's like so many people are so afraid to just be like, hey, I don't really know the answer to whatever random question you just asked me, you know?
Man, I've started posting stuff like that so much more. Like especially this week, I started posting these like hotel room isometric things that I'm doing because my gym's packed up, man. Like this is what I got, and like I'm getting questions that are valid questions that are very interesting. They just don't have an answer. Like, what's the transfer like from this?
Right.
This pushing on a strap. You know, what's the transfer like for that for your competition lift? Man, I have no idea. Like, just lots of questions like that. They're good questions. They're just I don't know. It reminds me of uh, just the way newer lifters treat programs, I guess. Like, hey, I'm doing 5-3-1, but do you think it would be okay if I change this for that? Like, I mean, I understand on one level, like you just want to sanity check some ideas that you've got, and
Yeah.
that's fine. But lots of times I feel like lifters, what they're really doing is asking for permission. It's like
Yeah.
you don't need permission. It's your program. Do what you want with it.
So, I actually think that's a really interesting point that I want to uh, build on a little bit is sort of what you mentioned, Jim, and then really you kind of expounded upon it a little bit, Mike, is like, I think what you're seeing is the average person is mostly influenced by marketing. And when you are, marketing is the art of confidence. And like when you talk about a con man, that's just short for like confidence man. And people, that's what you want to hear because you want to think that there is this all-knowing entity. And the problem is that's not true. That's not reality, and it's a lot dirtier than that. In reality, it's a lot more messy. The problems aren't so clear and so one-dimensional. So I guess the way I look at those, and it is undertaking the long road approach that can get frustrating and be very long term. And it's convincing people to accept almost, again, the non-linearity of things. But I think they're teachable moments. So just like you said, is when someone comes to you with that question, you're getting a cross section of their understanding of things at that moment. And their understanding of things might be this program was built generically, so I need to adapt it to be individualized for me. That's probably true, but not in the way they think it is. So they think it needs more variety, it needs more moving parts. And the reality is they need to concede that I need to just accept one thing or a few things to measure at once and get a really clean, and you talked about signal to noise, a really clean signal first before I can take 10 things and try to manage all of those, and then I just have signal everywhere, and I don't know what's noise and what's valuable.
You know what?
I think that's something that I brought up when we were kind of framing this conversation initially, Ben, was that, that signal and noise is something we talk about all the time, and reducing the noise so that you can see the signal more clearly, that's almost always the goal. But if you are in a situation where there's no signal, you're not moving in a positive direction, then there's nothing to amplify there. You've got to look somewhere else. And if it's inherently more noisy, then it's just going to have to be more noisy for a little while. And then you can work on, simplifying things once you have some signal to amplify.
Kind of reminds me planning training and goal setting and all the things we're talking about. It's almost just like a conversation between two people. If you go into a conversation and you're like, I'm going to plan the next, like if let's say we planned this podcast for like hour and a half.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
it's all scripted. We're all just reading off the prompter.
Like you got a goal, but ultimately if you say something that isn't on the script, and I'm like, hey,
yeah, it's over. The podcast is done.
Like, this podcast is over. Like, and ultimately, it's a more comfortable place to live in. Like, it's when you realize you don't have as much control over the response, but what you do have is your response to. You have control over your response to the response. Yeah. That's like such a better place to live, at least from an anxiety standpoint, because you're not worried. It's just like, if I pay attention, I'm going to be in a much better spot than 90. Like if you want to make it about other coaching companies, if you pay attention as a coach, you're going to be in a better spot than 99% of the other companies, or, whatever.
I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that.
It's just, maybe that's just me and my own ego. Like, I'm better because I pay attention. But that's ultimately the value of questioning yourself, because now you can actually question even, was I paying enough attention? And you can take some more responsibility for things that you can control. And then the other ones you can kind of let go of to some degree.
You touch on a really important point, and I think that is the value in having, again, a group rather than just a single entity. Is there is a scalability problem in coaching. It's not a perfectly scalable operation like a consumable is or like something else is. And you're right, at some point span of control is lost, the value is lost, the ability to ask people those questions and have those conversations. Like you said, coaching is a conversation, or you could say it's like a dance. I mean, you're basically, your job is to move with how they move in response, and hopefully do it appropriately. So it's not this, you're not doing the robot. But Mike, I actually want to ask you a follow-up in terms of the signal noise part. Is when you say that things are going to get more noisy, I actually would like clarity on that as well. Is I guess what exactly do you mean? You mean for the coach, for both the coach and the client, and at what point? So if you're accepting that things are going to get more noisy, where is the how does it get cleaned from there? What is the mental model of cleaning it from? Because you can't just keep getting noisier and noisier, right?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, pragmatically, like I'm coming in at lots of the training and programming decisions from the emerging strategies framework place, so that's one of the main themes there, is to try to simplify the training process. Like, you take one microcycle and you just repeat that microcycle for as long as you get results and things like that. You're simplifying as much as you can while still expecting a good result. So, not to go too far off course here, but somebody asked me once, like, well, if you're trying to simplify, why wouldn't you just train only the competition lifts with only one protocol? Why would you vary anything at all and just see how long that lasts, and then you can diversify from there? Well, you could, but I don't believe that's the best way to go. So I'm kind of starting further down the tracks, so it's kind of an arbitrary decision-making point, I guess. But let's say that you've got somebody and you're applying this kind of simplify things. Well, I should say the whole point of trying to simplify those things is so that you can see, hey, whenever we're doing this, the response is good. Whenever we're doing that, the response is good. X followed by Y is good. Y followed by Z is not good. And then you make those types of inferences, and hopefully you can build productive training in the future. Well, that's great as long as you can do something that is producing some sort of positive movement, some sort of positive signal. Now, if you've got athletes like we tend to get occasionally that struggle, and man, we will rack our brains coming up with creative solutions to, work around recovery problems, to work around just you name it, man, just all kinds of different things. The lift's not going up the way that you would expect them to for most people. And occasionally, there have been a couple people who we kind of get to the end of things where we're going like, what ideas are left to test?
Right. Right.
Well, maybe we need to test more of a shotgun approach to things. We need to start varying things more often. It's introducing noise into that system, but if it produces some sort of positive movement, then that's the thing. Like, who cares if we're really carefully parsing out what's effective, what's not, if the training isn't turning over any progress. Ultimately, I mean, that's kind of rule one, right? It's like you've got to do the thing that makes the athlete stronger.
That makes a lot more sense.
That's
yeah, because I didn't even understand it at that point. So have you noticed a pattern? And this is almost like a comparative notes thing. Have you noticed a pattern in those people that were low responders, not necessarily non-responders, like anything that you could see as a correlate to? There seems to be this intertwined characteristic of these people that aren't getting what most of the other are.
I want to say, I mean, we could take a lot more careful look at this, I guess, but I want to say, kind of off the top, they tend to be more anxious people. They tend to be stressed just generally. And not necessarily like injury history, but just kind of prone to aches and pains. Like nothing like specific, like, oh, now we've got a strained adductor that we need to go through a rehab process or anything. It's just every time we start to make any headway, they feel terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you can't keep pushing in that direction. So it's usually, like off the top of my head, I want to say it's things like that. These aren't people that, and they don't have any aspirations even of like, going to worlds or anything like that. They're not here for that, but they are here to get stronger. And it's like, that's the interesting problem to solve, is how do you, move those chains.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating. I think as time went on, that almost became the more fascinating problem to me than the how do I get someone who's already stronger. And it's like, why is this? I'm expecting noise here. Why am I not? Or I'm expecting signal here. Why am I not getting anything? When the overwhelming majority when I do this, this happens, and it's very predictable.
Yeah.
And it's hard to not come to some level of conclusion. I would say I'm more on this side than not at this point. Are some people just not made best for this? Like, not that they can't make progress. So I think we're looking at it in two different ways. Whereas yours is, how can I'm willing to throw out the rules or whatever foundation I've built that works for everybody else, and let's just maybe develop a new rule set for this data point, meaning person. But I think the other side of it is the potential of asking, are they trying to force themselves into something that they're just not made to do? And that's not defeatist. That's not like that they should just give up powerlifting. I think it's more so like conceding that maybe this level of expectation needs to be dropped back, because you see a very tiered response to anything. Like, that could be endurance running, that could be resistance training, that could be learning, like anything like that. And I think it's just an interesting inner world of someone whose job is to get someone their best progress, where you don't want to almost accept that, or you don't want to face that potential, but it might be there. And like I said, when I said comparing notes, I think there actually probably is a lot more overlap. If we were to compare profile, if we were to build a profile of the person who got the least predictable results, I would imagine, or I would guess, it would be a lot more similar than not across, no matter what coaching they were getting.
Yeah. I mean, well, have you found kind of a similarity in, I guess, your low responder response? So you've got is there like a strategy that you kind of kept in your back pocket that's like, hey, this person's not responding to the normal things, maybe we throw this at them because this usually works for the low responder types?
So it definitely differed. It definitely differed from person to person. But I think if I was to choose the most general response, it would usually start by trying more, which didn't tend to work well. When I say more, it's more of the things that typically worked. Or it would produce a response, but the magnitude of increased stressor for response, or the ROI, was so incredibly low that it's like, this person's just going to get hurt. That's going to be the only product of this. So then it sort of became pulling back, and like, then it's facing your own biases, is where, like, I think for me it was looking at, okay, what simple answers could answer this question or problem? Okay, volume typically works really well. And specifically high specificity volume, so volume within higher percent of 1 RM. And when that doesn't work, then kind of the theme we've revolved around is like, it's questioning your own interpretation of reality. And and then it became, what thing have I missed? And I think more later in, I guess, my coaching career, it actually became higher specificity, lower volume, letting people do RPE work that typically we would defer to more percentage-based stuff. It was actually letting those people, it was basically challenging them to need to be fast, to need to get out of their over-analytical tendencies, because you can be over-analytical with 90%, because on paper you should be able to do it for at least a few reps. So you can analyze while you're moving, and you can actually slow yourself down and still complete the lift. But if you're talking high RPE, you can't. It becomes a life or death thing. It's like, if an animal's chasing you that wants to eat you don't have time to sit there and think about, do I want to run fast? Do I want to run 90%? Right, yeah. Like, how much effort do I want to apply to getting away from this predator? So it did seem that tended to work better than going down the higher loading path. But I think I would say it's very much the same as, at least philosophically, as what you said. Is it's basically, okay, I need to reinvent a new rule system for this individual. So let's look at things that aren't complete departure from what I would consider the closest things to laws we have in physiology. But they're going to be a pretty dramatically different thing on paper than it would look for someone else.
It's just really interesting. So, I mean, philosophically, we're coming at this from the same place, looking at it the same way, but pragmatically, I think we've come up with some different conclusions, and that might have something to do with our starting points. I mean, it's funny, like, I've developed a reputation for being like a higher, like a more of an intensity driven program, writing more intensity driven programs.
Yep.
More high RPE driven programs, which, I mean, I've talked about this before, like the way I came up, like 9 RPE was lower than what most people were doing. So like 8s and 9s seems moderate to me, but I see that that's not the norm anymore. But anyway, I just bring that up to say that if that's kind of my starting point, and I believe your starting point was more specific work, more volume oriented, probably lower RPE on a per set basis. Like what I found for those people who are not responding to, our more typical fare is kind of going in the other direction. Like I get the feeling that managing the volume, at least the way that we do it, is not, I don't know, it's not a complicated problem, just that if they're having difficulty recovering, then we adjust the volume to the point where they can manage it, But if they're then recovering but not responding to the training, then, that seems to be an intensity problem to me. So what we end up doing a lot of times, you've got someone who's recovering but just not getting stronger, is reducing the intensity, reducing the RPE. And I would say that if we have a go-to for kind of our low responder strategy, that might be it. But I mean, it's always following athlete response, because if you've got somebody who can't handle those types of things, like I've got a lifter right now or I've had several over the years who, for whatever reason, can't handle rep work. Like it's got to be below 3. And it's not that they're, I'm a power lifter, I hate cardio. It's not that. It's that they have some sort of pain issue or something that they're working around, and like it kind of turns into a limit. Like, well, okay, so we can't do lots of reps, and I mean endless sets of like endless triples at 70% is just, you get bored to death, and you can't set a PR if you quit the sport. So
Right.
Anyway, I'm kind of rambling on at length here, but I would say if we have a direction that we tend toward in those cases, that would be it.
So I think I'm going to use an analogy for this and try to use it to merge an explanation for why I think seemingly very different, maybe someone could argue polar opposite approaches can still work and produce the response you want. And it's one that I think is superficially obvious, which is trying to get a tan. So what you're trying to do is you have to concede at some point that you're going to challenge the system. You have to, because if you don't, the system being the person's body, if you don't, you're not going to drive adaptation. I'm not saying the magnitude. I'm not saying you need to crush somebody and see if they could stand up, or push somebody to the point of blistering where they're going to burn. But you need to do something that's a little bit more than before in some iteration to drive adaptation. So I think, like I said, one that people can watch and is a lot more tangible than seeing muscle adapt or anything like that is trying to darken their skin, get a glow, is like you can produce that endpoint in a few different ways. You can drive the intensity very high for a shorter duration, and you can get darker skin. If you do it too long, too hard, you'll burn. So there is this middle point that is the optimization zone, and you can do the same thing. Is you can have less intense radiation, and do it for longer duration and get darker skin. But everybody will burn at different rates at different times. So there is an individualized component, and that is genetically based. Like if we take someone, and I'm sorry for picking on redheads, but if you are a redhead, you're very fair skinned, you're probably going to burn a lot faster and not really get much tan. And I think you are going to see that in programming and response to programming. So I think, again, and this is just an evolution of me looking at the problem different as time went on, is being less interested in what are we doing versus them, who's superior, more so what are we doing versus them, meaning the collective body of people programming. Why are all of us getting a seemingly positive response when it looks so different? Like, what is the thing that's intertwined? Because and this again goes back to many conversations we've had outside of recordings, is just that I don't believe the periodization model as we know it explains that. And if it does, it doesn't explain it well. And I think what's emerging a lot more, what people have extracted from all of these strategies over time that work, I'd argue probably a little too aggressively, is like, yeah, if you really drive home that concentrated thing that's pushing response, which is high specificity, high intensity, you will get a really high magnitude of response. But I think the unanswered question in that is, when is it too long, and where is the point of too much? Because I call it riding the intensity train. And I think you can really, if you get into, like, let's say someone merged both of our theories, which is we're going to push the volume, we're going to push the high intensity. I think that's really where you see that inflection point of trouble. Because you can get a very, very large response, but I think it's high risk, high reward for sure.
It's like a stress management, a fatigue management problem, right? Yeah.
The other thing that you guys are assuming to mention is that two different potentially polarizing approaches can work. And if you take that from like a philosophical perspective, like, of course, because you're working with a wide variety of people and most of you are probably working with many people at once, the thing that I find the most interesting is when a certain approach doesn't work for someone, but if you make enough tweaking to that approach, like subtle tweaking sometimes. So I have an example. I've had a lifter that's been struggling with like high RPE, like even like a single out of 8 is too much for them. And anything close to a single out of 8 is just too much mentally. They get too excited. They compare it too much to their competition performance. So for a while, we were getting pretty far away from that. We just thought, okay, this guy's going to do high rep work, by 6 at 8, by 6 at 9 work for pretty much all lifts, and everything else is going to be above that. So 10s and 12s. And we did that for a few blocks, like probably 5 blocks in a row, where we just kind of slightly tweaked that dial, right? And eventually that one, just no dial I could tweak to a subtle degree would be enough for them to continue to respond. So then we had a conversation and we got back to this idea that, all right, maybe the single out of 8 is just too much, but what if like a double out of 7 is enough, right? And not even enough, the dose that you need. And if you just give them too much more than that, it's too much. And that I've noticed that the more I mess with that idea, the less dogmatic I can get with individuals.
Yep.
And that's where we can kind of mess up, I think, sometimes, is like, well, they're not high responders to high intensity, but they are to low, and so we're just going to stay there forever. Eventually, maybe you haven't got as creative as you thought you had, in the other direction.
Yeah, I think it's the artistry component of programming. Is I really don't think it's this perfect world, this perfect solvable, you know, one simple equation applies to everybody. And I think you're right. It's everything we've talked about so far. It's communication. It's challenging your own assumptions, and it's being willing to actually be formative in the approach alongside them, not just I'm the authority figure. I'm telling you what to do. This is what you're doing because you are ordered to do it.
Yeah, I don't think that'll go. I don't think that goes terribly far these days anyway. I may have. I know I've talked about this before, and I can't keep all the formats straight, but I was doing a seminar, and I was talking to a couple of the attendees about just the differences in coaching attitude between now and, say, like Bobby Knight era. It just used to be that the coach was supposed to be the one that had the answers. They were the general in charge, and the athletes were supposed to line up and do what they say. But now it's a much more collaborative approach that seems to be favored. And I thought it was interesting. So the person I was talking to about this says, well, I think a lot of that has to do with the internet. But maybe not in the way you think. Maybe it's more like the availability of information just makes it like, well, coach, you say this way, this is the way it's got to be, but so-and-so does it different. Ben does it different. Jim does it different. Mike does it different. How do you explain all that? And I mean, at some point you just kind of have to face up that, like, well, it's a lot easier to navigate that from a collaborative standpoint, like, hey, we're going to figure this out together, rather than I've supposedly got all the answers.
Yeah, you are literally competing with the world now. It's not just your local gym, your local territory, your local competitors. But I think that makes it better. I think that puts a lot more pressure on everybody to be, I guess, legitimate, or to try as hard as they can. Whereas maybe you can get away with a little bit more. I don't know, though. Maybe you can get away with a little bit more in the past. But who knows? I mean, at this point, you also have to... There is a written-in assumption to that people have the ability to distinguish between good information and bad. And I do think... Because there is a lot more out there, but at the same time, when you log into Instagram, you could still see those accounts that just, it's like they repurpose a post from whatever else just to get maximum exposure.
It's kind of frustrating.
Oh, it's very frustrating.
Like when you've seen behind the curtain, and you've, from like even like a less malicious perspective, but even in the more malicious perspectives, like if you've seen some really messed up stuff behind the curtain, and then you see someone posting like, look at this show, like this is the greatest show ever, and I have the best thing that no one else has.
Yep.
Like, and not only that, but people are digging it.
Yeah. I think, and when we've seen this, I think we've all lived this at this point to at least some degree. Being involved in fitness, Mike, probably you to the most, is seeing how much the landscape, at least the incentivization, has driven a change in the landscape. Because the reality is, like, you can be 20 years old and have a career now as a coach just based on an online presence. You don't even have to, like, you may have never had to attend a powerlifting meet, but if you could have built some kind of presence and then enough of a social following behind it, like, you can be up there and not even knowing what your deficits are, but you look at the endpoint as, I'm making a lot of money, so I must be good. it's like it can be a lot more challenging. Where I think before, when there was less of an influence on that, it's like you would have had to have met the people that you're competing against, you know. And I realize I'm presenting it's sort of a straw man, but for the sake of of the the example, then you would have had to have been at the meets face to face with the people who are your competition. Everybody would have had there'd be a lot more direct face to face social challenge, I think, to at least pushing you to have to be, I don't know, stand behind it or something. I don't know if that goes anywhere or not, but
Yeah, well, I mean, it's making me think about, the different viewpoints and personalities that, I've known. I mean, powerlifting definitely existed long before I showed up.
yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, to some extent, I think there are characters and people fill the role of the characters that need to be played, almost. I mean, it's probably not a real charitable way to look at it. But
Yeah, but I think it's a good way to it's a good example or a good explanation.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You
You can hide nowadays. But
I
I don't know.
don't know.
Is that something that
you
you guys see
all
all
that
that
much?
much?
I
I mean,
mean,
I'll admit, like, I don't. I'm obviously part of the coaching world, but I wouldn't say that I like know all the players. Like I know the people that are in my circles, I guess.
Yeah.
And I don't know how wide that circle really is.
I think what I see the most of, and this is probably also based on being in the attention competition of supplements, is the impact and the actual the influence of digital marketing, and actually how potent it actually can be. And then you just look at the amount of pages out there and the amount of pages that can be run just putting up an infographic of, powerlifting information and stuff like that. So I'm kind of looking across, I guess, fitness more broad than just coaching. Because you're right. I don't even know of that 20 something example. I couldn't even give you a name of someone I know I'm sure there's people out there who are 20 somethings coaching, but I don't even know those names now either.
I would say if there's anyone that has a stake in this 20-something game, it's me. I mean, I think.
Tell us all the names, Jim.
I mean, like I don't have a big list of people or anything. It's just that I think I hear a lot more experiences from the athletes of other coaches that are, whether they're awesome or not. I hear a lot of them, and I guess it's just frustrating because sometimes I hear a bad perspective of someone and then a good one of that same person, and at the same time I also want to make sure I'm allowing other people to change. Like I think I have the tendency to, or I used to more, like, oh, this is bad, they're good, or whoever, and now it's more like, okay, maybe they've made some decisions that aren't great, but everyone has, and I think that luckily I've been around people that have allowed me to like improve my, maybe not from like a malicious, like I haven't been malicious, but there are ways to coach well that if you start coaching you don't necessarily know, like you don't, if you go into this thinking it's all about programming, it's not necessarily your fault that that's how you think, because that's a lot of times the message that you're being sold to. Like people sell books about programming, they sell books about their coaching practices and their programs, and so you think you just got to do that and then you'll be a good coach, and other people don't know any better. Like other athletes don't actually know that, hey, maybe coaching is a little bit more than just this. And I always talk about this with my friends like my age, though they're lifters my age. Like you don't know what you don't know. Let's say you have a relationship with someone and you think it's good, but you also don't know what another relationship is like and what you might be missing out on. And if it's your first time getting a coach, your first time working with someone, and you think this is the pinnacle of coaching because everyone says it is, that you're around, but it's not.
Yep.
And then from being someone that's both like young but also old in the sport, like I'm young by age, but feel like I have the experience collectively of Mike and Mark and Paulie and everyone on the team. It's like I have this really unique, maybe concerning view on all that, because it's like, but there are there's so much that you just don't know, and I can't necessarily be that person that's just like, hey everyone, you don't know anything about coaching, and like there's so much more to it, but because ultimately it's almost like I think I'm doing the best.
Right? Well, maybe the better way to frame it is that it's just different. Like the way now for you to develop traction is different, and that is going to create different potentially concerning outcomes. Because it is hard to say that it's wholly bad, because I think you can make the argument on the other side of saying it is getting information out there to a lot broader of people. And I do think to some degree, I would hope that the more effective things will rise to the top over time. But in saying it's different, I do think the hurdles that exist to become an authority in the field are very different based on how you can get eyes and how you can drive people through funnels through marketing. Maybe that's the better way of putting it.
You also have to let people figure out a lot of this stuff for themselves.
Yeah.
Too, because no one told me any of this stuff that I just said. I kind of had to go through it, and I had to buy into some of the BS early on, because that was exciting, and luckily I didn't buy in anything that was like super damaging. I don't see too many damaging perspectives, like seriously damaging. Just maybe perspectives that I don't agree with anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I guess the real quick point to that is, I think the potential danger in it is that you may not have to be as exposed to those rectifying situations as you would have at your time, because it was sort of just starting out, and maybe I am characterizing social media bad because of my not love for it, but it certainly does seem that way as an outsider, that you can be allowed to keep your safe space, keep your bubble a lot more safe and protected on there, and not have to let in what you don't want. Whereas in a setting that's like a classroom, that's academic, your opinion is going to be challenged, and you might get embarrassed in person, and that would probably, you'd hope, correct you. So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, the echo chamber issue is something that, I think society in general is still grappling with.
Yep.
But Jim, kind of something you made me think of is I would love to kind of get to work again with my very first client. So I've told a story before where like I didn't even know online coaching was a thing. Like somebody emailed me and asked me to coach them, and I was like, sure, yeah, I'll figure it out, and I would love to get another shot at that, because the experience has to be so completely different now versus what it was then, and I mean, you would hope so, right? That,
yeah.
Over time that you improve things and that you see things differently. So I really like that perspective of, giving people space to improve things over time. But yeah, I'm also, I guess, nobody has to, nobody has to change their views for the better, but you do hope that they try, and I think most people try. I guess maybe I'm an optimist.
No, I would agree with that.
I don't have a lot of perspective on it because I think I just see the world through my eyes, and I think everyone else does too. And like I think I'm luckily the people around me are I mean, Mike, like if I were to have done this on my own, who knows my perspectives on things. Like the fact that I had access to people who had done this and was willing to allow myself to be really a noob. I mean, once I released that, this is I had my own thing going. Once I released that, and I was like, time to be a student again, even though I'm still coaching. It's a weird kind of dynamic to play because you still have to be confident in what you know for the athlete, and then also allow yourself to grow for the future athlete.
Mm-hmm.
And like again, luckily I had a lot of support in that way, but I think it's a lot scarier if you're on your own to say, hey, actually I don't know that much right now, but I'm confident that I will. Because how do you
That's an important nugget, though, I think, for aspiring coaches as well. Like, this is something that kind of comes up in DMs now and then for me, is that, as a coach, as a leader, you do need to project confidence, but that doesn't mean lie.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean to pretend that you have the answers. I'm definitely not saying that. But you do want to clearly communicate what the process is going to be, how you're going to get there from here, and things like that. And you need to be able to project that confidence when you have your coach's hat on. But then at other times, you need to be able to take that off and, ask questions, ask dumb questions. Like, to be honest, that's one of the things that I would like to get back. I don't know, maybe I'll come up with some anonymous screen name or something like that so I can ask dumb questions again. But I mean, that used to be a lot more part of I think just like the broader fitness experience back in the forum days.
Yep, I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just push everything to Reddit. That's all.
Yeah.
Start our Reddit subforum. This podcast was the beginning. I'm calling it right now.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like
oh yeah, we've touched on many areas.
Well, it's just cool. Like we talked about this all conversation, and like, I mean, yeah, we kind of stayed on point for the most part, but ultimately we talked about. It sounds like what we wanted to.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it was fun to jump. That was. I mean, that was why I immediately reached out to Mike to do it, is because I knew that there is no necessary endpoint. We can just kind of just go, and I love doing it. So, yeah.
It's just nice to have that. We talked about the echo chamber. Like because you've had such a different experience in your own coaching practices, but have similar experiences, but just different approaches. Like, to me, that's so super cool to listen to. I just sat back and like, wow, you did all these things, and you're willing to acknowledge like things that you just did differently. And I don't know, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, I guess, when I got into this, I didn't know I'd be able to get to a place where you can have a conversation with another coach and didn't just think they're an idiot.
I hope that can happen more in the community, because I think it needs it. I really do. And I guess it's maybe somewhat unfortunate that it took coming to the end of Mayan to try to force or encourage that. But I genuinely think, I still think, and I said this to Jason before I got involved with TSG, is I think collaboration is the future. I really do. And I think at some point that's going to mean, and I know Mike and Jim and you guys, like, we've had conversations with, the group of us with Jason, and I know we've always played nice with each other, but I think more people are going to have to, I think they'll see that in time.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think a certain amount of agreement's required to kind of get the conversational ball rolling, but
yeah.
the periphery of that's always the most interesting. I used to ask a question as part of this podcast, where, like, just in preparation, sometimes during the podcast, like, about areas where we might disagree on things.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit too on the nose. I don't do it quite that way anymore, but that is, I think there's interesting conversation to be had there,
Well, at least you give people an
we ought to do
opportunity.
more of, I was going to say, we ought to do more of, like, exploring that territory as well.
The RTS Call Out podcast.
You disagree with us, man? Let's talk about it. Cool, guys. Well, I think it's probably good to wrap up there. Thank you for listening to the Reactive Training Systems podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with your friends, your family, and anyone who you think would benefit from the content of this podcast. Thank you, and we will see you in the next one.